This is the China-Hollywood Greenlight podcast, episode number 12.
And rolling sound. Quiet. Here we go. Ready.
Speeding.
120, take 7. And action.
This is Karen McCann, the host of the China-Hollywood Greenlight podcast, a podcast about creating and distributing content for both Hollywood and China. If you like the show, please go to iTunes, subscribe, and leave a rating so other people can find the podcast. The more we work together, the more opportunities will be out there for everyone. Any links mentioned in the podcast can be found in the show notes, as well as a full transcript at China-HollywoodGreenlight.com, and look for episode number 12. Before I introduce today's guest, I'd like to start out with a motivational quote to encourage our listeners to continue on their path to achieving their own green light. And today's quote comes from Henry Ford. And he said, "The whole secret of a successful life is to find out what is one's destiny to do and then do it." Today's guest is Brendan Davis. In 2012, Davis formed Killen International in order to focus on Chinese co-productions. In 2013, Davis produced and executive produced 13 U.S.-based episodes for a long-running Chinese TV show called Jia Pian You Yue, which airs on CCTV6. The Killen-produced episodes feature Marvel Comics legend Stan Lee, directors Justin Lin, and M. Night Shyamalan, and actor Sean Astin, who was in Lord of the Rings, among others. In 2016, Davis moved to Beijing in order to live and work full-time in China. After guest lecturing at the Beijing Film Academy and consulting for Chinese clients, Davis joined Adamus Films in Beijing. Most recently, Davis has joined production and VFX management company BangBang, founded by John Dietz in Beijing as director of special projects. In addition to his producing and consulting efforts, Davis created and hosts the weekly podcast Big Fish in the Middle Kingdom, a show about fellow foreigners who move to China to do things that are ambitious, unusual, and sometimes a little crazy. Well, Brendan, thank you for coming on the show today.
Karen, thank you so much for having me.
Great. Well, I've told a little bit about you, but why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself personally and more about your business?
Sure thing. Thanks again for having me here. So I'm primarily a producer and a consultant on EastWest cooperation. So this is a kind of a great opportunity to talk to you. And I also host the podcast, as you mentioned. And basically, I grew up in the Southeast U.S., as we talked about, and have always been in and around film and music. And I've had a lifelong interest in Asia. And that came from discovering writings like Alan Watts and things when I was 13. So cut to, jump ahead many, many years, and I had wanted to help be part of this next wave of what's happening here in China. And my specific focus has shifted a bit, which we'll talk about as we go through your other questions. But these days, I am primarily focused on researching what's going to be the next iteration of how to cooperate. And so I'm focused on some research and development here at this new company, as well as producing my podcast.
You mentioned your early interest in China. Tell us more why you want to work in the China market.
Well, always been interested philosophically, as I said, and interested in other cultures. And of course, Asia is such a dramatically different worldview if you grow up in the U.S., especially, a long time ago, back when I did. So, and you didn't have the internet, so you had to learn these things very slowly. And I would say there are a few things that really planted the seed. I have a attorney friend there in Los Angeles who has worked with a lot of Chinese clients over the years, and I got to know people through him over about the last 10 years. And I also started teaching. I was teaching in the master's programs at New York Film Academy there in LA. And it was a very international school, so I probably had about 1,000 international students over the 6 years I was in and out of there. But about 300 to 400 students were from China. And so, some of them are right out of undergrad, but some of them had been working for maybe 5 or even 10 years here in China before going to the States to learn, the Hollywood way. And so through having them as students, I actually got to hear their take on how things work here. And it seemed like a really interesting opportunity because a lot of my job on that end when I was teaching and then also consulting with Chinese clients trying to work in Hollywood was about how do we bridge these cultural differences, both in the business culture specifically, which I know is a frequent topic of yours. And so that's been my interest, is to try to flatten the world. I have kind of more personal sort of, my very personal goals are about trying to, be friendly with people and trying to continue society's progress, et cetera. So this is my little way to do that, and also, pay the rent.
Okay, well, you're in the right place at the right time, definitely. Now, go ahead.
Well, hopefully so.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I know no 2 days are the same, but just to give the audience a little bit about what you do day to day, what are 2 or 3 main tasks you do on a, quote, typical day?
Sure. So as we said, I'm starting a new division of this company, which is going to end up being its own company eventually. So it's a little unusual now. But I would say that on a typical day, it's sort of one part dealing with consulting clients and talking with people, helping to connect the dots, and also just helping friends and colleagues with referrals. There's also one part of it that is tending to ongoing projects, so being involved. And I have my hand in a lot of different things, and I'm helping develop a series here. And then there's a part of it that's dedicated to my podcast efforts. And occasionally I pop up on CGTN, sometimes talking about China film and EastWest cooperation. So doing some media things and talking to nice folks like you.
Okay. Now, these projects that you're developing, you're producing, writing, directing?
It's kind of all over the map. I guess I wear a lot of hats. Producer consultant is my short version, but I have a TV series that I've written a pilot for that is in development. I have several different projects that I'm involved in as a producer, but not the lead producer. So I'm a voice in the room. And then there is a documentary project that I can't really talk about yet, but because we're early days development, so I don't want to get ahead of myself, but it's a project that I'm a producer on and I'm also the director on. So a lot of different things. And I'm helping develop a very dynamic web series for China that's basically 45-minute episodes, 12 episodes a season, and it's what they call elevated genre. It's something that's more like it's very dynamic and sort of comic book but live action. It's a live action piece, but it's very energetic and kind of surreal, and it's totally for the Chinese market. So
you've got all these amazing projects. How did you find your business partners, and how do you suggest the listeners find a Chinese business partner?
Well, in my case, I would say some of these things are self-generated. Some of these are from friends, partners who have been friends and colleagues for a long time. And so I'd have to kind of do the forensic analysis for each one. But I can give a more generic answer for the listeners. And I can say that I met actually my new primary partner here, John Dietz, which we'll talk about BangBang a little bit more in a minute, I guess. That was a very serendipitous moment, speaking of that, because he found me through the podcast. We're both part of China-Hollywood Society, and I know you had Melanie on, and I've been part of China-Hollywood from the U.S. since I guess late 2012 or early 2013, and it's very active here. There's a Beijing chapter that's very active that I'm part of, and we have a WeChat group for the China chapter, and there's some people who find their way in from outside, but we have like a local chat group. And one of my episodes, I'm all over the place, but I'll bring this back around. A few of my episodes have been entertainment heavy. My show is a broader focus, but I've had like Rob Kane on. I've had Jesse Weiner on, the entertainment lawyer, who have these old China hands. And so one of these episodes got posted in the China-Hollywood WeChat group. John happened to like it and comment and contact me and just say, hey, we should hang out. Hanging out, we realized, wow, we are very different and coming from different worlds, and he's a very award-winning, respected guy in his field. But we really were in sync, And that's the most important thing, is because with finding any partners, there's networking, and I can give some suggestions for events for people to find people for China, specifically like China-Hollywood Society, which you actually publicize quite a bit. But I would say that the fundamental thing is, in China, it's a long term. I believe it was Melanie who said this. Many people have hinted at this. This is a marathon, not a sprint. Right. And I know you have a lot of China time here yourself, much more than I do. And the Chinese way that they approach relationships interpersonally certainly applies to business. And if you are an outsider, maybe double that. So you have to be in this for the long haul, and this is a long-term commitment for me. So in the case of my current partner, John, it's that we really just like each other, and we're on the same page. We're in sync. We have a lot of overlap in our thinking, and then we have different things we bring to the table. So that's important, is find someone who you can really see yourself spending a lot of time with, and even time where you're not necessarily task focused on a project, because the transactional nature of the way projects often happen in Hollywood, although relationships grease the wheels, when you get to business, it's very transactional. And in China, it's much more like a courtship that just seems to never end. So I know we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in terms of how people should you've had a lot of good suggestions on previous episodes of your show. Go to AFM, go to the China Forum at the AFM, go to the Chinese or Asian-related film festivals, right, wherever you live, so you can meet the up-and-coming writers, directors, producers. You can meet the established people who are there to speak on panels. That's a great way to meet people. And then, of course, there's LinkedIn, but I hate being sold, and a lot of people, there's not much you can do on LinkedIn unless you really have something already in common, I think.
You mentioned briefly something about a WeChat group in China. Would you recommend that for Americans to somehow get involved with the Chinese WeChat group?
Well, it's I don't moderate it. It's a semi-closed group in the sense that you're welcome to join if you already know people in the group and you're already somewhat established in this field. It's not for, hi, I'm a rookie and I have a bunch of questions. So you should be in it. If you're not, you should already be in it. And we'll talk offline. But I don't have any administrative role in the group or in the WeChat group or with China-Hollywood, so I would defer that. I would say that if you already know, ask around. If you're already going to China-Hollywood events, then I think sure you should absolutely be in it, and it's easy to search it. And I think many of your guests are in the group. So. Oh, great. Well, I definitely have to join that. Now, having all these different projects and, trying to meet all these producers and partners, sometimes that's a bit difficult, which leads me to my question. Tell us about an obstacle you encountered on a past project. How did you overcome it, and what did you learn? There have been a few, and since you're nice enough to plant the questions a little bit ahead of time, I've had some time to think about it. I think the one that I would mention is that there's a learning curve that everyone who works with China discovers, which Sky Moore talked about. Contract is just the beginning of the negotiation. It's and here it's not like it is in the West. That is what I would underline. So you think you have a deal. And just because you have a signed piece of paper, it could be signed and chopped, with a stamp. It could be as official as anything. You could have drank Baijiu till 3 a.m. with somebody who's the deputy vice mayor of this or that. It doesn't matter. It matters in terms of building the relationship, but until the money's in the bank, it's not real. And the specific, I was working with several partners to develop, and we were attempting to produce the very first China-New Zealand feature co-pro. We were very close, and we basically had a Chinese quote-unquote financier committed. And what I learned, and part of my learning curve back in 2012, and 2013, was I learned about firsthand about the way that many quote-unquote investors here, and I'm using the air quotes on purpose because they're not what we would think of as a real equity investor in the West, are not actually the direct investor themselves, and they're not even a finder in the Western sense where they want to take 5% and get you the money. They syndicate the investment. They claim to own it, but then they work to find all these other people to actually support it. And as I discovered sometimes happens, and I've been involved in this a few times and had to correct it, and I've heard countless stories along these lines, but many times they will promise things without your approval. Independent film, it's very tricky. If you're doing independent film, basically, is very tricky in China. Doing studio film is very tricky. But so syndicated investment, beware of that. If you think you have an investor, and they could be the richest guy or gal on the block, but that doesn't mean that they're planning to put in, one kwai into your project. It means that they're planning to talk to their network, and they are going to want a giant piece of the project. They want more than a finder's fee for doing this. So we had one of those who we didn't realize how he was playing. He was not, I don't want to, it's fairly hidden online, so I don't think you could search it, but he was not acting honorably, as it turned out. And actually he's out of the business as far as I know now. And he was someone fairly prominent. So beware, buyer beware. If the money's not in escrow, it's not real.
So that's a good short answer, but just to point out stuff to the audience that they might not be aware of, because a lot of people think, these Chinese investors have lots of money, especially if you have someone who is known to be wealthy. Would you not know where their money is coming from somehow? Would they pretend it was their money, or if they're telling you it's not my money?
Well, I'm sharing something that was part of my learning curve. I'm a little more sophisticated now, but what I'm saying for the audience's sake, because I think your show is aimed at people who are trying to figure things out. I mean, most of your guests know what I just said already, but people who are trying to figure this out would encounter this, where they see someone. In this case, I know my guy had money. I'm very well aware that he had plenty of money. But he was not putting his actual skin in the game. He was investing to play devil's advocate from their point of view. Someone like that is investing their relationships. They're investing their face to their friends. I mean, he was invested. He was committed. It was unfortunate. There were extenuating circumstances in his case that led to him not being compromised and not being able to follow through, actually. So that was unfortunate. But that illustrates the problem is that, if he had the money, if it was actually his money that he was investing, then that money could have been moved. So the big challenge now, of course, is about you can't move money offshore very easily, which is a whole other conversation. But film finance in China is extremely difficult. So you need to make sure that your China side partners are as transparent as required, and you need to have someone who you implicitly trust dealing with the China side. Exactly.
Well, that obviously you got over that huge problem, but let me talk about the current situation. If you could magically solve two current problems, what would they be?
I love this question. I think most of the great answers have already been stated. I would refer I'm going to answer it, but I would refer your audience to especially listen to Niall or Sky Moore or Melanie's answers on this, and there's several others that are echoing in my head. A lot of great things have been said about the nature of contracts and finance and the language issues and things like that, the cultural issues. What I would say is that I would love to solve that's a little more practical is that we still have a big disconnect between job responsibilities and titles. In the East versus the West, there are many jobs that are the same job. There are many jobs that have the same title, and they're kind of the same. They're same-ish, but then there are different responsibilities, and there are different timelines for how things happen. There's different orders of reporting. We're never going to change that completely, but having mutual bilateral understanding of the difference of the role, especially of the producer. This is the one that if I could wave a magic wand and go into Harry Potter land a little bit, I would unify the role of the producer to be equivalent in the West as in the East. To have the East expectations match. The reason that projects tend to be director centered and king, where there's like the director who's the king of the mountain here, is because there has not been the professional producer class historically to the same degree. I mean, you have people like Bill Kong who could teach anybody in the world about this and how to do it. but the Bill Kongs are very few and far between relative to the people who are sort of middle managers or money finders, and the producer does not drive the project historically in the same way that the director does in general. Now that is changing. The projects, the prominent projects with the A-list people here, you have people who are working in a more international system. So I would magically make the producer class be professional across the board here, and I would make sure that there was understanding about the differences in job titles and responsibilities so that you didn't have things fall through the cracks and you didn't have conflicts and issues if something isn't, managing expectations is always the job of a producer, and it never ends. It never ends from development through delivery.
Is there a second problem?
Well, I was trying to say that to me the producer one merits its own.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a big problem. Yeah. Okay. And you mentioned projects. What sort of future projects are you looking for? Film, TV, budget, story elements, and what do you think the Chinese studios are looking for?
Well, personally, I'm actually not looking for anything other than bags of money, and I say that facetiously. I'm not actually necessarily looking for money right now. I am actually, if anything, I'm open to a few more consulting clients, but because the companies that I'm involved in, both this new opportunity and my own company that I'm developing strictly as a production and development shingle, I'm partnered with several experienced writer producers, and we develop internally. I was thinking about this looking at your questions. I would say that most everything I've done in the last almost everything I've done with China has been internally developed, where either one of my team has been, it's someone who is a produced writer and we developed it internally that way, or we developed the idea as producers and hired a writer to do it. I don't accept unsolicited pitches. I can't do anything with it. I'm not a producer to go find you money and make your project. So what I'm looking for is, I'm open to a little bit more kind of consulting and cooperation, and I'm always glad just to help people as well. I don't have to have a retainer to do it. But in terms of what the studios are looking for, I think that there's several different things you could stick on the wall. Of course, one are the mythical, magical co-production that's going to satisfy both markets, or the China versus the international market. And we should maybe talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But so the co-production that actually works, that's number one. The second thing are films that can export well, but don't necessarily have to serve this market, although I would say that's a small percentage of films. But the primary thing, other than co-productions, are simply advancing the state of Chinese film, making Chinese film and TV compete creatively and technically. Technically, it's already pretty much there. Creatively, it's getting there. That's the last mile of road that has to be bridged, is on the creative. And there's extraordinarily creative people here. It's more about letting those creative people do their thing and supporting them. So what I see and hear from my friends who are day-to-day involved in that world is about advancing Chinese films. And there's some fantastic filmmakers here. There are some really interesting projects coming out. And that's actually why I'm here. I'm not focused on co-productions anymore. I have been previously. I've done some, and I've developed more than I've had produced. But I'm focused on advancing Chinese film and then helping people cooperate. But I'm not losing any more sleep on co-productions currently.
So now you said the Chinese studios or companies are looking for obviously the mythical co-production, but also they want their local films to travel, to cross borders. So is there a particular genre you hear about that is popular, or a particular story elements that Chinese audience hope to have in the theater?
Well, in terms of, audiences here, and I want to give you a good answer. I would say that audiences here are similar audiences in the West, in that they want to see good stories, they want to be engaged, and they like all kinds of genres. But action adventure does tend to play better currently, and sci-fi. Romance is hit or miss. It kind of ebbs. Romance here is sort of like horror in the West, where it seems very cyclical, and sometimes sometimes you can't get enough horror movies in the theaters, and sometimes you can't give them away. The romantic comedy is kind of in a rut here, but it'll probably come roaring back. When somebody makes a great one, it'll come roaring back. I would say that the films that have the best chance of traveling, and what I'm saying is they could be films that are aimed at a global market, but were not necessarily produced as a co-production, other than maybe there's a star. So the films that have the best chance for that are the ones that somehow magically minimize the language problem, because that's what's going to keep us as having really two fundamentally separate industries forever. Is the language problem. So there's going to be some crossover, but we're not going to become one unified global entertainment industry. China is always going to have China as a market, and so that's.
There was I interviewed Larry Namer a while back, and he was saying that even the Chinese government told him, or his Chinese partners told him, start shooting in English, Chinese local films.
Right.
So is that is that your idea for the future going ahead, is doing local films, but for the domestic market, by hoping that they might travel overseas? Yeah,
I heard that was a good interview with Larry, and of course he's someone who knows what he's talking about, and I would recommend that one to your listeners if they haven't heard it. For me personally, I'm not focused on English language films. I'm focused on Chinese films for Chinese people. And I have done some consulting. And you mentioned in my bio, I spent a year developing a Chinese language film that was meant to be a big international film, historical action adventure blockbuster. But I'm focused and working here in the new role. We are working on some of the top tier films, big blockbuster films from Chinese directors in Mandarin for Chinese audiences. So that's where I see the biggest growth, and that's where I want to be part of. Okay, that's good. That's good. Now this is kind of a backwards looking question. If you could do your career over again, what would you do differently? Well, if being born rich is not an option. If that's not an option, then I would say go to law school, okay. and not because I want to be a lawyer. And some of my best friends are lawyers. That's but for the simple fact that, especially, really, I wouldn't change anything. And I think Melanie got very philosophical, and you wouldn't end up exactly where you are if you changed the smallest thing. And so I'm at that school of thought. But hypothetically speaking, I was actually pre-law for a couple of years and wanted to go into entertainment law to help my music. At the time, music was primary, but music and film careers in the future. And just understanding this is one of the big differences, the primacy of the entertainment attorney in the international system versus in China. They're kind of like the redheaded stepchild. I don't know if that's politically correct. Sorry. But the entertainment lawyer does not have a front row seat, a primary seat at the table here. They're seen as somebody to come in and sweep up a bit, after the grown-ups have had their dinner. But of course, in the real industry, in the rest of the world, in the outside industry, the entertainment attorney is a primary player. So I would have caused myself 3 years of pain, but I probably would have saved, 3 years of pain in my life. Otherwise, it would have probably been an equal sum trade. But so study the law, and I have self-educated and have become very familiar from being involved in contracts now. So okay, now you're obviously a producer and a consultant. More on the producer side, what skills or talents are essential to being effective, especially if you're going to try and work in the China market? Do you need to speak Chinese? It definitely helps. I speak just enough to be conversational, and I don't read and write. So because I did not have the Chinese language learning bug early enough, unfortunately. I speak Spanish much better than Chinese, and not very well. So I shouldn't even act like it's good. But in terms of China, speaking some Chinese is great, mostly to be social and conversational and to build relationships and to be chatty. But for any kind of business situation, there's too much nuance that can be lost. And also it respects the time of the people you're dealing with, that you have someone who is a real ace on your side. Right. to translate and interpret so that you're not wasting the other party's time as well. Sorry, I kind of lost the plot of
other
the
skills,
question.
Other skills you need?
Yes. Yes. Well, focus. Speaking of losing my train of thought. That would be an example right there. Focus and concentration is great. Keeping an open mind, and again, some of the other guests have touched on this a lot, but really understanding that the fluid nature of things in China, and this gets into the bigger cultural issues, which I know you're aware of because of your China time and your studies and experience here over the years. But I see it as applying to business, and I'm telling you on the ground 2018 that it still applies, does not change. If anything, it's more important because it's part of what makes this place uniquely China. The simple fact that people build relationships a certain way. There's a certain communal aspect to the way opinions are considered. And yeah, there's the big man or big woman at the head of the table in a given situation, but everybody gets to play, or else why are they in the room? Even the lowest person in the room, they're there to say a little thing. Right. And so the people who are kind of in the middle of the pack have, a handful of things to say. And then there's the big person who does a lot of listening and then gives a monologue or two, and they're the one who you're listening to. But keeping an open mind. So be on time, which is sometimes very tricky. And I was running a little late today, as we discussed earlier off mic. But being flexible and understanding, again, Skylar Moore, and I think a few other people touched on this, the contract is the beginning of the real negotiation. You're expected to be flexible as situations change and as things develop. The contract here is viewed as a way to show that we trust each other and we intend to work together and see this thing through. But the terms in the contract are not carved in stone in the same way that in the West we put that emphasis on it. So you have to be the phrase China flexible is something that a lot of people use, and you have to be very China flexible.
Okay, this next question is a bit tricky. What question did I not ask you that I should have?
I think that I touched on it slightly. I kind of planted the seed for this because I think the question might be, are co-productions still the holy grail of East-West cooperation? My answer is no.
No, okay. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. And there are people who right now who are going, what is this guy talking about? Well, it is not. That should not be the primary focus, in my opinion. For this reason, it is so incredibly difficult. There are other things you can do where you can actually be making things. You can actually be productive and get into the market. You can create projects that get localized. And of course, that's not just translated, but that's reinterpreted for the China market. And we can get into that more. But you can create projects, you can create stories, create IP. You can localize existing IP. You can create things that work and then set it up as a Chinese project. Don't try to make it a co-product. Don't try to make it serve two masters. That's fundamentally the problem in a nutshell with co-pros, is that they're great in theory. Very few of them actually get across the line, and it's getting harder and harder. A few of your recent guests have talked about some of the regulatory changes, and there's some geopolitical currents. I'll just say it that way because I want to keep my visa intact. But there are various things happening in the world. Sky Moore's answer to this question, I remember it took you by surprise, but I was not surprised, and I was me tooing and clapping, and yeah, he nailed it. So his answer is the best answer I've heard on your show so far, actually. His
advice basically was, forget the American China co-pro, go for a European China co-pro. But
there was that, and he was also talking about the geopolitical aspects of things.
Oh, yes.
That was what led to the European aspect. Right.
Now, just a side question: if you did a local film in China, would it, even if it's in Mandarin or even if they want to shoot in English, it wouldn't be a co-pro? But if you added a couple Western actors, would that help? Maybe.
I would say it's going to depend. They have to really have value to the local market. That gets into the idea. That gets into the area that has been discussed previously here and elsewhere a lot about, like Chinese audiences are resistant to the reverse thing, where you have a Western project and you sprinkle you try to China it up a little bit.
Right.
And people just are very, I mean, I don't know if anybody's like offended by that, but people just don't care. That doesn't move anybody. Right. That doesn't drive sales. Oh, they got Angelababy to be the girlfriend. Great. And no one cares. So I think the reverse of that is true. I think there are Chinese films that need Western elements but on camera for the story purposes, like Wolf Warrior 2. I mean, they needed Western bad guys, and they needed Western, they needed neutral people from other countries for different roles. So if it's intrinsic to the story and it feels organic, that works. That's one way that you could approach trying to build a co-pro. I want to give you some hope, because I know you're really wanting to do co-pros, and I think people should do it if they have the magic trick. I mean, action, fantasy, sci-fi, you're gonna find some co-pro success there. Somebody's gonna do it, and I'm working on the thing too. I'm just saying that I also want to be able to pay the rent. And if that's all I'm focusing on, I'm better be really comfortable eating ramen noodles, right? So the area where there's the opportunity is actually, and that's part of what my friends here at BangBang, which is VFX management company as well as production, they manage the pipeline of giant movies. We don't really do the VFX here. John and his teams manage the process, and they bring in the best vendors from around the world and the best local vendors, and they make all of that work. That's where the opportunity is, because although this is more on the post and VFX side, here where my new office is, that's working. That's been working for like 5 years, and that's where I see the future. There's a lot more hope for technical talent from the West, like the very best technical and creative talent. The actors themselves, the opportunities are for the people who are pretty much the big stars, right. and that'll change over time. The other thing is that Chinese people, I had a lot of students who are now making projects, and some of them are getting fairly successful or they're developing some pretty big things. And this next wave of folks from here are very international. They're very global in their outlook. So they're going to be making things that feel more like the United Nations versus one country. Okay. So that's going to happen. That's going to happen too. So I'm actually optimistic about co-pros in the long run, but it's not a primary channel, and that has to do with release dates in China. Right. What you have to remember is that you could have you could build the perfect co-pro from a Western point of view in terms of elements. You could magically crack the story, et cetera, et cetera. You're still competing for a very limited number of release slots. And yes, co-pros are not subject to the quota. The practical reality is that the government has actually tightened up the restrictions on how many foreign films or non-Chinese only films get screened every year. So you're not competing against the quota, but you are still looking for screens. You're looking for time, and there's all these blackout dates. Right, you can't get in the theater during Chinese New Year. Yeah. So about 15 to 20% of the year, you can't be on a screen in the first place. Right. So you're fighting a real uphill battle if that's what you're focusing on. I think it's better to focus on a film that's really for China, that has some appeal to the West intrinsically, organically, or a Western film where you use some Chinese folks and maybe they even see it outside of China, and you get the Chinese diaspora who's watching. You increase your box office in your other markets because you're especially attracting Chinese people who are relocated. Okay, well, that you've given us like 4 different pieces of advice there, but let's just because that's my last question is, what advice can you give to those aspiring to tap into the Chinese market? Let's kind of tie a ribbon around that. And you said, obviously the opportunity is like VFX and managing the pipeline, focusing on films for China. Perhaps hopefully they appeal to the West, but that's not the main goal. What other advice, in a nutshell, would you give? I could give you the short version of the short answer to your question would be to really make an effort to learn this market and care about this culture. If you approach this in a transactional way without a sincere interest in the culture and the people, you're not going to succeed. So you need to actually care about getting to know China and getting to know the people. This is not a transactional market. This does not work like the European film market or the U.S. You can't approach this in a transactional manner. So you need to approach this in a much more organic relationship focused way.
Okay, good advice, Brendan. Now, lastly, would you like to tell the audience how to keep track of you or share some social media details or website links?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking. I would love it if people would check out my podcast, which is Big Fish in the Middle Kingdom, all about foreigners who've come to China like myself. And my website, the blog for that is the URL is crazyinagoodway.com. Because I think that you have to be at least a little crazy to do this, but hopefully it's in a good way. And I'm in all the popular podcatchers, so if you search Big Fish in the Middle Kingdom, you'll find it. And you can also find me on LinkedIn, and I'm blanking on my URL, but I'll get it to you for your show notes. But if you search Brendan Davis, China, or Beijing, I think you'll find me. And there's a picture of my big fat head, so it's easy to see it's me.
Well, Brendan, I've learned a lot, so thank you very much, and I'm sure our audience has learned a lot too. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Karen, I really appreciate you having me on, and I think you're doing a great show.
Oh, thank you. And we'll see you at the premiere.
Deal.
I've got 3 key points. Number 1, Brendan compared Hollywood relationships compared to China relationships. He said Hollywood relationships were more transactional, and China, it was more like a courtship. But in terms of getting Chinese to invest in your project, he did make this point. Even if you drink baijiu until 3 a.m. with some deputy mayor, it really doesn't matter. You may build that relationship, but until money is in the bank, financing is not real. Number 2, Brendan cautioned about Chinese syndicated investments. He mentioned how one investor wasn't putting in his own money, but syndicating the investment and ended up wanting a giant piece of the project. And because it wasn't this one investor's money, it couldn't be moved offshore, and ultimately the film didn't go forward. As Brendan says, if the money isn't in escrow, it's not real. So make sure your Chinese partners are transparent or find someone you implicitly trust dealing with the China side of the production. Number 3, in China, it's right now the director, not the producer, that drives the project. So if you're shopping your script, get a director first. And now for my takeaways. I've got 4 takeaways. Number 1, China is looking, as we all know, to advance Chinese filmmaking. Technically, China's already there. In regards to creativity, it's catching up to Hollywood. But as we all know, current Chinese language films don't travel that well. Brendan said if Chinese films are to travel, they don't have to be produced as a co-production, but somehow they have to magically minimize the language problem. Now, if you heard my interview with Larry Namer of Baton Development, he was told by Chinese government officials to start shooting his Chinese projects in English. So I believe you will see China want to export their culture, start shooting some domestic films in English so that they will sell more internationally. Number 2, Brendan, on one hand, doesn't think China-Hollywood co-pros are the holy grail, as he calls it, mainly because they're so hard to pull off. So what can you do? Brendan suggests localizing your IP for China. I completely agree with this. In fact, I've taken it a step further, and I'm now shopping 3 projects as Chinese domestic films. Brendan added that even the perfect co-pro, despite avoiding quota restrictions, will still lose about 15 to 20% of screen time in Chinese theaters due to China's preferential treatment to Chinese domestic films. Number 3, other areas of opportunity would be VFX. Now, Brendan is lucky because he partnered with an expert who already has a shop in China. That's hard to pull off. But you can always be like some pioneering spirits and just show up in China and sell your talents to a studio, as Sky Moore's clients did that he mentioned in our interview, and his clients are doing great. Number 4, regarding co-pros, I have an optimistic attitude, and even Brendan said the next wave of Chinese filmmakers have a more international outlook, and they'll be making things that look like a mini UN versus one country. Now, in this next section, this is where I call this the episodic part. The interview part is what I call the procedural part in TV terms, where I ask the same question format for every guest. In this part, the episodic part, I update you on my own projects, and I have 2 updates. 1, an executive producer approached me and made an unusual suggestion. He suggests we cross-promote 2 or 3 of our projects to our contacts in return for EP credit and a fee. Since we both have projects where music is a key element, I have a script called The Kung Fu Rock Chick, if that tells you anything. Now, and he's got 2 projects. Now, I can see some synergy there because we could think outside the box. For example, approach not just film companies, but music labels, pop stars, film execs who used to work in the music industry, etc. So I'm considering this. One thing that this EP executive producer said that Brendan actually echoed was localizing IP. This executive producer suggested I hold back, say, for example, the China rights to the Kung Fu Rock Chick so I could make it in English and in Chinese, or even create a Bollywood version. Really, I think this idea is workable. In fact, I know it is because here's an example. I was at a script workshop in Asia a while back, and we practiced pitching in front of a couple of producers. After class, one of the producers came up to me and said he spent half his time in Vietnam and would I consider letting him make a Vietnamese version of my film? Well, to be honest, I never took him up on it, but who knows? What do you think? Leave a comment and let me know if you think I should pursue this. Number 2, lastly, I took Brendan's advice and created a Chinese domestic film version of my action comedy and another script, an action thriller called The China Conspiracy. As Brendan mentioned in Wolf Warrior 2, the film, you had many Western actors because it was intrinsic to the story. I think that this is the same for my projects. It makes sense to the story, and I imagine would make the Chinese film travel more internationally. That's my hope. So thank you for listening. To show your support, go to iTunes, subscribe, and leave a rating so other people can find the podcast. And I'll see you at the premiere. 一会儿见. Bye.